Hearing that out loud, it strikes me that's a rather cheery ending. Not. Yesterday, while I was reading the paper, and then again today, listening to the radio, some of the news, I thought this might well be one of those weeks when preachers who'd written something earlier in the week think, this isn't what I want to say on Sunday. And all of us, I imagine, probably wonder, as we listen to horrifying news, what can we do besides pray and perhaps give to a relief organization? But I'd like to suggest that for our own mental health, we also need a break from the news at times, maybe what we come to church for in part. And so that we just hold all of those things on our hearts and minds, hold them up to God in prayer. And I loved seeing that you mention a lot of specific petitions having to do with other parts of the world and climate change and all sorts of things in your prayers of the people today, that we hold all that up in prayer and that we look to the Word of God for inspiration as we wonder, what can we do? How are we called to live in times of such turmoil, uncertainty, and political divisiveness? Well, it just so happens that there's a common thread that runs through the readings that we've heard today, including one that we didn't read, the second lesson of the letter of James. And it's about following the rules or the laws. That's a very big concern in the book of Deuteronomy, which we heard from first. And that word Deuteronomy means second law. The basic theme of that book is the reaffirmation of the covenant between God and the people of Israel, who have been through all sorts of unimaginable ups and downs. Moses recites the mighty acts of salvation that God has performed for them, how they were led out of bondage in Egypt. They wandered in the wilderness for many years. They survived rebellions and the wrath of God, and they're now poised on the edge of the promised land. Moses reminds the people that God has been with them all the way through all those challenges, and that God will remain with them, even as he, Moses, cannot be the one to lead them into the promised land. Now, spoiler alert, he will die as they are about to cross over into the promised land, and leadership will fall to Joshua, son of Nun. And I thought maybe some of you knew that from a crossword puzzle, but I asked my husband, who does them all the time, and he said he didn't remember that, but anyway. The condition for all of this, for the promise of new life in Canaan, for all of God's faithfulness and steadfastness in staying with the people of Israel throughout their torturous journey, is that they must be obedient to the law. Moses lays that all out for them, as we heard this morning when he said, "Give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you." Now, if we kept reading into chapter 5 in Deuteronomy, we'd come to the 10 Commandments, which most of us probably learned at some point in Sunday school, even if we didn't recite them, if we can't recite them all in order now. But I imagine most of us are much less familiar with some of the other little laws or rules for living that are spelled out in other parts of the first 5 books of the Bible, especially Leviticus. Now that book, if you've ever read it, you know, can sound downright weird to us. It's a sort of manual for worship with rules for the right conduct and consecration of the priests set apart to minister at the sanctuary, to offer sacrifices and so forth. And it contains laws that set forth distinctions between things that are considered ritually clean or unclean. And it seems that everything then was either clean or unclean. So this reminded me this week of two much more recent books in this century written by people who tried to follow all the rules found in the Bible. The first was published in 2007 and called The Year of Living Biblically, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Bible as Literally as Possible. The author, A.J. Jacobs, describes himself as a secular Jew, but adds, "I'm Jewish in the same way the Olive Garden is an Italian restaurant." He was curious about religion and the Bible and decided to dive in head first, trying to experience the Bible himself and find out what's good in it and what's not so relevant to the 21st century. So he tried to follow every single rule as literally as possible, obeying what he calls the famous ones, the 10 Commandments, including love thy neighbor, and the one that says, be fruitful and multiply, but also the hundreds of oft ignored ones. Do not wear clothes of mixed fibers. And of course, they didn't have polyester blends in those days, but you couldn't mix fur and wool, for example. Do not shave your beard, and stone adulterers. And he tells a little story about how he embarrassed his wife once by being brutally honest in front of other people, saying he already had enough friends. He didn't need to meet her friends. Noting that the rules are quite different for women, the author of the other book that came to mind was a beloved writer and Episcopalian who grew up in an evangelical Christian tradition and died too young at the age of 37 a couple years ago, Rachel Held Evans. Like A.J. Jacobs, she attempted to take the Bible literally for a year, and she tried out a different thing each month. Her 2012 book is entitled A Year of Biblical Womanhood, How a Liberated Woman Found Herself Sitting on Her Roof, Covering Her Head, and Calling Her Husband Master. She found the hard way that her quest for what some people call biblical womanhood, including some of her evangelical friends, requires more than a gentle and quiet spirit, in the words of 1 Peter. It also meant growing out her hair, which she said was wild and unmanageable, so she could hardly wait to get her first haircut at the end of that year. She had to get up before dawn, and she had to sew all her own clothes by hand, of course. She also had to obey her husband, remain silent in church, and she even camped out in their front yard during that time of the month and for 7 days afterward, when she was considered unclean and could not touch a man, even to shake a hand or, I suppose, bump an elbow, as we might these days, or to dance with her husband at a wedding. Both of these books are written with insight and humor, but despite some criticism, especially from the right, they are both sincere and respectful attempts to explore and personally practice what the authors read and wondered about in the scriptures of Judaism and Christianity. One thing that seems pretty clear is that some rules that may have been fitting for people thousands of years ago make no sense for us now. And besides, as one reviewer wrote, the Bible is not a rule book for life, but the stories of God's redemptive interactions with humankind. In our tradition, we say that the Bible is the living word of God, subject to interpretation and reinterpretation, a collection of books written down over many centuries and reinterpreted by countless generations in a multitude of contexts, and of course translated into many, many different languages. I remember one of my seminary professors years ago said something like, unless you read the Bible in the original Hebrew and Greek, there's no such thing as literal meaning, because as soon as you translate certain words, the meaning changes a bit. So what do we hear in today's gospel that might help us with all this? The Pharisees and scribes, Jewish religious authorities, are complaining that some of Jesus's disciples are not following the rules about washing their hands and the foods from the marketplaces. Of course, they didn't know about the germ theory, so it wasn't the kind of reminders about frequent hand washings and how to do it that we've been hearing in the last year and a half. So for the people of Israel, it was about what was ritually clean or unclean. And Jesus says that it's not what goes into us that makes us evil or good, clean or unclean, right with God. It is about the human heart. And of course, he doesn't mean literally that organ that pumps blood and keeps us alive, but figuratively, the inner disposition, the seat of evil intentions and of good, of love. In another place in the gospel, or other places, we hear Jesus say, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And over again, we hear him preach in many different ways the same message, the gospel of love. As the presiding bishop, Michael Curry, often says, if it's not about love, it's not about God.